Pretty much every day and everywhere, you can pretty easily find people discussing the canon of Dragon Ball. It's one of the most widely debated and controversial things in the series. Something that every part of the fandom references at least once in their lifetime. I'm sure you guys have too. And recently I've been seeing more and more of it, and honestly, I don't really care. If something's canon, if something's non-canon, I don't really mind either way. And honestly, I think the whole concept of it in Dragon Ball is pointless. Along with all that, I've noticed a lot of people confuse what is canon and what isn't. It's such a convoluted thing to discuss, and that's why I'm here to try and clarify it a bit. Mainly looking at a few things. What actually is canon? How many different continuities exist? And does it even matter? We'll be covering all that and more today in this video. So first off, let's start discussing why there's more than one canon. And bear with me because I'm going to be saying the word canon a lot in this video. Just in the past minute alone, I've probably said it more than the entire year so far. Whenever people discuss the idea of canon in the sense of Dragon Ball, usually it refers to one thing, anything that's been written by Toriyama himself. We'll get more into that later, but really, everything's canon in its own way. The word's used a lot to describe one singular canon, but really there's multiple. And let's start by discussing that. Dragon Ball has multiple different continuities, more than you probably even expect. Let's start with the absolute most basic one, the original manga. This is basically regarded as sacred scripture. Every single thing that is said in here is canon. Every event, every statement, the specks of hair drawn in Goku's head. People will always reference this and say, this is the main canon. And yeah, that's a great way to look at it. But oftentimes, people don't realize that the anime and manga are actually separate. For a multitude of reasons, you could argue that the two aren't even the same. Because if you look at the anime of Dragon Ball Z, and even the original Dragon Ball anime, there's a lot of stuff that didn't happen in the manga that only happens in the anime, and it doesn't really follow the manga one-to-one. Z is probably one of the best examples of this. There's a ton of filler episodes that didn't exist in the manga. Like, remember that one where Gohan found a robot? That never happened in the manga. Garlic Jr., that exists in the anime. But again, that's separate. That only happens in the anime. Another big one, the Otherworld tournament and that whole arc with Otherworld. That's also anime exclusive. None of that happened in the original story. That includes pretty much everything that happened in that arc too. Super Kaioken, Pikkon existing. I bring this up in my video sometimes where I reference the manga canon rather than the anime canon. And yes, I know it's kind of confusing, but the two aren't really the same when you look at it like that. So, what about Dragon Ball Z Kai then? I mean, everyone says that cuts out all the filler, right? So that means it must be canon. Well, this one's also kind of confusing too, for a couple different reasons. For one, the same does happen in Kai, although to a much lesser extent. It does follow the manga a lot more closely, pacing, the different events that happens, even some statements. But there still is filler, so if you want to argue that Z isn't canon because of the filler there, Kai also has that same issue. It did remove a lot of filler, just not all of it. In case you're unaware of what filler is, as I've implied, it's basically anything that doesn't appear in the original story. It could be something small, like an extra scene that's been added. Or it could be huge, it could be an entire arc. It's not exclusive to Dragon Ball either, it happens with pretty much any anime that exists. A lot of times filler is made to make sure the anime doesn't catch up with the manga, because sometimes the anime is so fast that they need to put themselves behind the manga. Anyways, with that short explanation aside, Kai does suffer from pretty much the same issue, although to a much lesser extent. Funny enough, Pikkon on the Otherworld tournament technically did happen in Kai. At the end of the Cell Saga, they do briefly show the Otherworld tournament in a montage. And Pikkon is shown in the Buu Saga during the final chapters of Kai. Although since the differences are so minor, I wouldn't really bother separating it. But if you want to look at it from a really purist standpoint, there's a couple separate continuities here that we just covered. The first one's the original manga, the second one is the Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z anime, and the third one is Kai. And this is just for the original story. There's more continuities, it doesn't just end here. There's also the movies for Dragon Ball Z. Since I'm speaking to a very general audience of Dragon Ball fans, I'm sure you've all seen at least one Dragon Ball Z movie. And you've probably noticed, they don't really fit in the timeline too well. There's always some sort of weird thing that happens that makes it look like it contradicts some part of the story. Like Tree of Might, for example, let's look at that. Supposedly this takes place after the Saiyan saga, but it doesn't make sense. The humans are alive again, Gohan has his tail. And it seems like pretty much none of the events on Namek happened. Also, Vegeta's not there at all. And you could tell this is after the Saiyan saga too, Goku even has Kaioken, and they know of Saiyans by this point. And this is just one of the many examples. And if you couldn't tell already, the Z movies exist in a separate canon. Besides Wrath of the Dragon, none of them really fit into the main story. Toriyama himself even states that the films are basically their own dimension. And the weird thing is, some films connect and some don't. Like the two Cooler movies, for example, those obviously connect. The three Broly movies, those obviously connect. Even Fusion Reborn has references to older movies. But still, none fit in the main timeline, there's always some sort of contradiction. Wrath of the Dragon kinda does fit if you look at it, and realistically you could just place it after the Buu saga. But that also isn't canon, just like the other movies. Alright, so we already have a bunch of separate continuities right now. But things get even more confusing once we go into Super and GT. Let's cover GT first since that's very brief. This is pretty common knowledge in the community already. Everyone and their mom knows that GT is not canon. Everyone always says that, usually to disparage it. And this is kind of unrelated, but don't let that deter you from the series. Just because it isn't canon doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. A lot of people avoid it for that reason, but I will say now, you're missing out on the Baby Saga, which is one of the best in Dragon Ball. And people that watch GT will probably tell you the same thing. Anyways, this is referred to as basically a side story. It follows the events of the Z anime, but really it doesn't exist in that same continuity of the manga. So you could kind of argue it's canon to the anime, but also not really. It's confusing, I know. And that's part of the reason people don't really reference it too much at all. That's another continuity that exists. Super is pretty weird though. Super has a few continuities of its own. Even though they're technically Dragon Ball Z films, I'm going to include Battle of Gods and Resurrection F as part of Super. If you're a Toriyama purist and you only follow stuff that's been written by him, that means you would consider these movies and the Broly movie canon. Because they are. This has been stated a bunch of times and it's been shown in the series itself. If you really want to argue what the canon timeline is, it would go like this. The original Dragon Ball manga, followed by Battle of Gods, followed by Resurrection F, and then the Broly movie. Also, this isn't really mentioned much, but the Tarble OVA is kinda canon because he is mentioned in Battle of Gods and Broly. So for all three of you Tarble fans out there, including me, he's canon, so don't worry. But if you look back at that timeline that I just made, you'll notice that there's a huge gap. Nothing between Resurrection F and Broly. And this is where it all gets weird. This is where we start discussing the differences between the anime and the manga of Super. Both of these actually have retellings of Battle of Gods and Resurrection F. So for those arcs, there's actually 3 different versions of those. Resurrection F is kind of weird too because it has its own one-off manga rather than part of the original Super manga. But between Resurrection F and Broly, it's debatable which continuity you want to consider as the main canon. Both of these follow outlines written by Toriyama himself, but they both go about it very differently. The Super anime has multiple writers, while the manga really only has one, Toyotaro, although there's some occasional involvement from Toriyama, and his name is all plastered on the manga. If you've read the manga and watched the anime, you'll notice that there's a lot of differences between the two. And this is why it's so confusing. They do follow a very basic structure. A tournament occurs between Universe 7 and Universe 6. Afterwards, Zamasu appears, as well as Future Trunks returning and Goku Black being a thing. It all ends off with a Tournament of Power, where Goku unlocks Ultra Instinct and fights Jiren from Universe 11. But these two are separate continuities too. So that's another pair of continuities that exist. And since they each have their own versions of Battle of Gods and Resurrection F, they kinda also are separate from the movies. And that's why everything is so twisted. For example, let's look at the Goku Black arc in the anime. In there, we see Super Saiyan Rage, we see Zamasu get that weird goo form that he has, Trunks destroys Zamasu's physical body with the Spirit Sword, and then Zamasu merges with the universe. In the manga, there's a couple other different things. Super Saiyan God is used by Vegeta and Goku, neither of which show up in the anime. Perfected Super Saiyan Blue is a thing there. Zamasu never gets that weird goo form. Trunks is revealed to have the powers of a Supreme Kai. And instead of merging with the universe, a bunch of Zamasu clones show up. But as I mentioned, they all follow a basic structure. Zamasu steals Goku's body and attacks Trunks' timeline. Zamasu and Goku Black end up fusing. Goku and Vegeta fuse to fight him, and the fusion doesn't work. Zamasu is then defeated by some sort of erasure from Zeno. And that's just a few of the examples. The same happens in pretty much every arc. The manga is still continuing though, so thankfully that remains consistent. As of now, there's only one continuity with Moro in it. Same with Granola, even though that just started. But I'm sure in the future we're going to have 20 different continuities of those two, so I guess enjoy the simplicity while you can. And like I mentioned with the Broly movie, there's only one version of that. There is a visual novel that exists, but besides that, Broly's in a weird spot because it's only one continuity right now. Thankfully, they don't really reference too much from the anime or manga, so it does fit both canons. And in terms of the manga itself, it even references the Broly movie. So thankfully, that's also not confusing. This is the only version of the Broly movie that exists. There's no anime retelling, there's no manga retelling. It was just these events. And that's basically all of Super covered. And to get even more confusing, there are other continuities, specifically from the video games. There's Heroes, which as you all know, that's a promotional anime for the video game Dragon Ball Heroes. And there's also a Dragon Ball Heroes manga. And Heroes is kind of crazy because it has multiple different timelines converging. I mean, look, you have Goku fighting Goku, 2 Vegetos fighting together, Vegito fighting Broly from Dragon Ball Z. It's all really weird. And obviously a bunch of other continuities exist beyond this if you want to look at all the video games. For example, there's Dragon Ball Legends. That's a really weird one too because that involves a lot of timelines converging. It's another confusing one because there's a lot of different characters from different eras. I mean, there's even points when Gohan from the Buu Saga and Gohan from the Cell Saga are in the same place at the same time. And that just goes to show that the video games do not care about the continuities, as should you. And there's a billion others I could cover. Fighters kinda has its own. Dokkan has its own. Even Kakarot has its own little details that didn't exist in the original series. There's just so many different things that have happened in the series. And knowing how things are with Dragon Ball fans, we always discuss it. We love to discuss every little detail of everything. I mean, weirdly enough, I even remember one time where I made a whole thread on Twitter about Vegeta's shoes. And that kind of shows how bored we are collectively as a fandom, so please, we need another anime. We are running out of things to talk about and we could really use it. That little tangent aside though, I've covered two of the questions that I wanted to discuss. What is actually canon and how many continuities exist? But there's one more thing that I wanted to answer. Why I think it's actually useless to even argue what is canon and what's not. It's such a pointless debate at times because so many different aspects of the series are different in each different continuity. For example, sometimes people will be arguing something and use statements from both the anime and the manga, but you can't really use that as a reliable piece of info, just because so many differences exist between the two. Super is a better example of this. Some people will reference things from the manga and the anime at the same time, which doesn't make sense because they're two different continuities. There's so much different between the two that you can't consider them the same. It just logically and chronologically doesn't work together. But even with that, canon doesn't even really matter in the main series anymore. Things will get retconned all the time that ruins things that we knew beforehand. Once again, let's bring up Super. That has a bunch of retcons. And as it continues, more and more things are going to be retconned. If you don't know what a retcon is, it stands for retroactive continuity. Basically rewriting the past. A good example of it is the Potara earrings. Potara fusion was originally permanent for mortals, and Vegito supposedly defused because of what happened inside of Buu. But in Super, that got retconned. It turns out Vegito actually fused because fusions have a time limit for mortals, only an hour, and it gets shortened if they use too much power. And here's another big retcon that basically proves why canon doesn't matter too much. As Super keeps continuing, more and more things are happening that basically retcons the entirety of the end of Z. That last mini arc that happened after the Buu Saga. Bulma there says she hasn't seen Goku in 5 years, but with Super, she's seen Goku in between that time period. Oob is another example. They've retconned him to be way stronger than he should be. Same with Buu, who in the Moro arc got stated to have God Ki. As the series goes on and on, they could just retcon stuff out of the picture. For all we know, the end of Z won't even happen. And the whole reason I'm bringing this up is because this is part of the original manga, meaning it should be canon, but it's continuously getting contradicted, alongside all the other retcons that exist. And think about this too, at a certain point before Super existed, people considered GT as the true successor to Z. Everyone knew Toriyama didn't write it, but still it was the main piece of Dragon Ball media that existed at that point. And it did actually line up with the events in Dragon Ball Z. And all this goes to show how much canon doesn't really matter. Not that it doesn't completely. I mean, I'm not saying something like you can go around claiming Dragon Ball Heroes as canon and everything there actually did happen in the main series. No. I'm just saying that I think the debate is kind of pointless between them. If something's canon or not, why does it matter? Realistically, the only thing you should care about is if the series is good or not if it was penned by one person instead of another. But the reason I'm saying this in general is because people get really defensive over what is and isn't canon. And it shouldn't really be that way. Canon can change whenever the series wants to. And even if something is part of the main canon and something isn't, so what? Who cares if Super Saiyan 4 isn't canon? People can enjoy it. That doesn't make it any less enjoyable. Or Heroes, for example. I personally really like Hearts as the villain. He's not canon, but who cares? I think he's awesome. You can't say that something's bad just because it isn't canon. And if you're going to discuss canon, what's your basis for what counts as canon and what doesn't? Because if you're going to go by whatever Toriyama wrote, like I discussed, even that's confusing. You have the different continuities of Super clashing with each other. Not to mention the fact that he had editors helping him too. It's not like he wrote everything there. If you want to be very specific about it, I'm not saying stop discussing canon completely. I mean, it is useful for certain discussions, and I even use it in my own videos. But if you truly want to have fun with Dragon Ball, don't pay attention to that stuff. There's so much more to enjoy if you look at stuff that isn't canon. I mean, my whole channel is basically based off that, so I guess I kind of am biased, but whatever. Point being, don't let the status of canon change your enjoyment of something. And don't fret too much about it. Simply put, it's just way too confusing. But that's basically all I wanted to say. So what did you guys think? Do you agree with what I said? And what are your own thoughts on it? Leave a comment and let's start a discussion. I mean, it is a discussion video after all. Anyways, if you liked the video, be sure to drop a like. It lets me know that you want to see more content like this on the channel. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe? As well as hitting the bell icon to get notified about any future videos that I upload on my channel, including more videos like this one. And with all that out of the way, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in whatever video is next. Hope you guys enjoyed this one.